What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, and I am bringing you yet another top Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. Folks, I put these videos out each and every Saturday, so if you haven't already, please be a subscriber to this channel and give the video a like if you love Pokemon card auctions as much as I do. This week, folks, I'm going to be honest with you, not a good week for several graded TCG items, particularly these two guys right here in CGC 10 are just looking awful. And we also have a few other concerning sales to go over as well, so stay tuned to the very end. You're going to love this week's auction recap. A great big thank you to this week's auction recap sponsor, the one and only lowpopping.market. Lowpopping.market, folks, is the market page for serious TCG collectors and or investors. If you don't already know, it's an Instagram page of high-end card dealers that have very valuable graded cards and very rare pieces of sealed product for sale. If you are a collector of PSA, BGS, or CGC graded cards, this is the place for you, as they have numerous high-end Pokemon card grails. And believe me, folks, a lot of these grails you won't find anywhere else. They add new inventory to their page almost every week, it seems. And someone new is always messaging me about the new grail they recently obtained from lowpopping.market, and I love it. And in my humble opinion, one of the best things still about lowpopping.market is the ability to trade for a particular item that you must have. And they make the trading process very easy and straightforward. Don't forget, they also offer international shipping and multiple payment methods. So do yourself a big favor, folks. If you haven't already, go follow lowpopping.market on Instagram. I will link that in the description of this video. Go check out what they have. Believe me, you won't be disappointed, and let me know what you get. All right, folks, let's get into the good, the bad, and the ugly of this week's Pokemon card auction, starting off with some Obsidian Flames graded cards. Here we have a special illustration rare Pidgeot EX, a graded card we haven't really seen come through yet in PSA 10, sold this week for about $97. And then we saw pretty much all of the Charizard EX cards again. Here we have a regular Charizard EX in PSA 10 that sold for a pretty healthy price at $175. And then we saw the Full Art Ultra Rare Charizard EX that sold at PSA 10 for $141, while the Gold Hyper Rare Charizard EX sold for $175. And then, of course, the most expensive card in the set, the Special Illustration Rare Charizard EX, sold for $580 this week. Here we saw another Magikarp illustration rare from Paldea Evolve, probably one of the most valuable cards in this set so far, sold for $450 this week. And then we saw a BGS 10 Black Label Japanese Gardevoir EX from Scarlet and Violet base that sold for $730. Now, here's where it gets to the ugly, folks. Didn't take long. We have the Metal Pikachu card from the Ultra Premium Collection box. If you recall, like 2 weeks ago, I was kind of dumping on this card because it sold for like $1,250, which is down drastically from when it first hit the market. This week, it sunk even further, selling an auction for about $1,025. So, man, anybody out there holding on to this card? Are you considering jumping ship? Might not be a bad idea. Up next, we have another unfortunate sale. It is the PSA 10 Magikarp Wailord GX from Team Up. This is an alt art card that sold this week for a new low of $475. And this card was selling a few months back for about $830, even higher than that, so almost cut in half in terms of its PSA 10 value. Another card that's looking pretty ugly, and this was on Heritage Auctions. It is the Charizard Holo from Celebration's Classic Collection in PSA 10, sold for $159. And this card, folks, was holding strong at like between $200 and $250 for quite a while. When this card first hit the market, it sold for about $1,800. And I know I've brought this up before, but it still blows my mind every time I think about it. So it went from a $1,800 card now down to about a $159 card. Not good. Up next, we saw a few BGS cards. Here is a Black Label Charizard V promo from the Champions Path Elite Trainer box, sold this week for $245.50. And then we saw a lot here of 14 BGS 10 Mario Pikachu poker playing cards. So all these cards are different. All BGS 10 sold for $3,050. That might have been a really good deal. What do you think? And then we saw the Black Label Luigi Pikachu Joker card sold for $710, while the Black Label Mario Pikachu Joker card sold for $720. Now, I know in this channel we talk about the poncho-wearing Pikachus quite a bit, but what about the poncho-wearing Eevees? Here is one of Eevee wearing Vaporeon. Got a PSA 10 and sold for $900 this week. We saw several very expensive Japanese full art trainer cards. Let's go through them. Here we have a Professor Juniper in PSA 10 sold for $926. Here we have a Japanese Pokemon Center lady from Wild Blaze in PSA 10 sold for $1,232. From the black and white era, here's a full art N trainer card that sold for $1,092. Here we have a full art Misty's Determination that sold for $1,338. Here we have a full art Bianca from Cold Flare that sold for $1,337. Here we have a BGS 10 Black Label Dendra from Triple Beat, sold for $1,525. And then lastly for our trainers, here is a Japanese full art Lycia that sold for a staggering $3,851. And the amounts that people are spending on these full art trainer cards just absolutely blows my mind some days. Whew, and this is one of those days. Up next, we have a few cards from the XY era. Here is a Mega Mewtwo EX from Breakthrough, sold for $204. Here's a full art Bridget, also from Breakthrough, that sold for $425. And then we saw this Charizard EX promo. This is a Black Star promo that sold as a PSA 10 for $540. And here, this isn't from XY, this is actually from Sun and Moon, but it is the Mewtwo GX from Shining Legends that sold this week for $690 as a PSA 10. Up next, a few vintage cards on eBay. Here is a Japanese Charizard holo from base set yet again. This card's coming by every week. Sold this week for $3,750. And then we saw an English first edition base set Zapdos that sold for $4,800. And then up next, I wanted to cover some middle children from base set, the guys we don't hear about very often. Here we have a first edition Charmeleon in PSA 10, sold for $500, while the first edition Ivysaur sold for $550, and the first edition Wartortle is always the most expensive of these three, selling this week for $1,242. And let's not forget the first edition Yellow Cheeks Pikachu that sold for $1,392. Up next, a few CGC 10 Gem Mint cards to go through. Here is an Unlimited Dark Raichu from Team Rocket, sold for about $350, while the first edition copy sold for $810. Here we have an Unlimited Blaine's Charizard from Gym Challenge that sold for $910, while the first edition copy sold for $2,113. Up next is a PSA Unlimited Sabrina's Gengar from Gym Heroes. This is a very desirable card that sold for $1,619. And then from the Neo series, we saw a CGC 10 Pristine First Edition Togetic that sold for $610. Here's an Unlimited Shining Tyranitar from Neo Destiny, sold for $1,388. Up next was a Crystal Celebi from Skyridge that sold as a PSA 10 for $2,076. And then from Fire Red Leaf Green, we saw a Charizard EX in PSA 10 that sold for $4,650. Here from EX Deoxys, we saw a Latios Gold Star in PSA 9 that sold for $3,383. And then here we have both of the Latios and Latios Gold Star cards signed by Fukuda, both authenticated and sold for an even $3,000. Now on to this week's PWCC auction block. We saw the Big Bad Snorlax from Jungle, first edition holo in PSA 10, and it sold this week for $7,800. And then we saw a few cards from the Gym series. Here is a Erica's Venusaur, first edition in CGC 10, that sold for $1,230, while the Sabrina's Gengar in CGC 10 sold for $1,710. And then we saw the first edition Blaine's Moltres, also CGC 10, sold for $1,710 as well. And then from Neo Genesis, we saw the first edition Heracross in CGC 10 that sold for $1,170, along with this CGC 10 first edition Pichu holo that sold for $1,890. Here we saw two of the CGC10 Typhlosion 17 holos from Neo Genesis, and they both sold for $3,360. From Neo Discovery, we saw the first edition Espeon in CGC10 that sold for $1,650. And then we saw a couple of cards from Neo Revelation. Here is a first edition Houndoom in CGC10 that sold for $1,860. The first edition Mischievous sold for $1,920, and the first edition Entei in CGC10 sold for $1,920. Here we have a PSA 10 reverse holo Crystal Charizard from Skyridge that sold for $3,720. From EX Team Rocket Returns, here is a Rockets Mewtwo EX that sold for $2,190 as a PSA 10. And then we saw a Milotic EX from Emerald Set, also in PSA 10, that sold for $3,720. And then check this out, folks. This is a card I haven't seen before. It is a Mewtwo Strikes Back phone card. Got a BGS 10 black label and sold for $2,310. And check out the face on Mewtwo, man. That guy is just living his best life right there. Up next, we saw this signed Japanese Gold Star Vaporeon, sold for $2,520. And then we saw this Japanese Gold Star Gyarados that sold for an even $3K this week. Here we saw an Espeon EX from Unseen Forces that sold for $3,120. And then we saw a CGC10 first edition Glurak, which would be the German base set Charizard, that sold for $3,600 this week. And then we also saw this authenticated Rayquaza Gold Star that was signed and sold for $4,680. And moving on to some ugliness in this week's auction recap, we stumble across the first edition Lugia in CGC10 Gem Mint condition. Has been like free falling the past couple of months ever since CGC turned their 9.5s into 10s. It started off hot and heavy, folks. This card was selling for $17,685 big ones. And then it sold for $13,800. Then it sold for $13,000. Then it sold for $12,100. Anybody seeing a pattern here? Then it sold for $9,000. Then it sold for $8,700. And what did it sell for this week? It sold for $5,880. So, around $17,000 to below $6,000 for this particular graded card. Not good. And we're not just going to pick on Lugia. Charizard didn't do too well this week either. A CGC 10 last week sold for about $76,000, and we saw another copy that sold for $66,000, and this week it sold for $54,083. So this one hasn't been hit quite as hard yet as the Lugia has, but give it some time. Here we have a Japanese PSA 10 Collection Moon Full Art Lily that sold for an even $9,000. And then we also saw, again from the corporate history deck, this CGC 9 Chansey that sold for $27,000. Which brings me to our auction of the week, and it has to be the PSA 7.5 Pikachu Illustrator card that sold for a whopping $289,200 this week. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to go follow lowpopping.market on Instagram. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know what you think of these auctions in the comments below. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks again, folks. That's all I got. I'll catch you all in my next one.